Trey Manchester about his debut novel, Well, We're Here. Hi, Trey. Thanks for being here.
Hey, Katie, thank you for having me. How are you?
Good. I'm excited to talk to you about this. Let's dig right in, okay?
Sounds great.
Okay, so what inspired you to write Well, We're Here? Specific imagery, memory, a moment that sparked the idea?
That's a really good question. So the impetus of the story, it's funny. So it came on the heels of a film I had done called The Things We've Seen. We were at a film festival, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to write next. And there was a celebrity guest at the film festival who I'd been bumping elbows with for about 3 days. And on the heels of that interaction, I was like, man, I really want to work with this guy. Long story short, we ended up getting nominated for an award with the film. We ended up winning a small festival in Huntsville, Alabama. And I was like, you know what? This is kind of like cloud nine for me at this point. I'm going to shoot my shot and see if I could find out a way to work with this guy. And basically just went up to him and said, hey, Michael, what would you be wanting to play in the future? Is there any kind of role you could picture yourself in? Kind of, figuring out what I want to write next. And I'd love to write something for you. And he was kind enough to tell me the kind of role that he hadn't had a chance to really play. And is this, he wanted somebody who had some grit, some, tenacity to him, but somebody who's gentle and kind and grandfatherly. And that was the specific word he said, grandfatherly. And I was like, okay, that was really the seed of what became While We're Here, right? It took a different path, right, becoming a novel at this point. But it was that relationship saying like, okay, if I wanted to tell a story about a grandfather, grandson, but then also diving deeper into basically fathers and sons in general, and just seeing what that would be. That was sort of the initial path that it took me down. But it all started with that film festival interaction and looking for inspiration with a person I wanted to work with one day, and he planted the seed for the core relationship in the story.
You mentioned here that you went from a script then to a novel. So did you complete the whole script before you decided to bring it into the novel form, into book form?
I did. Yeah, we were close to making the film. We had $1 million in financing sitting there. We had cast most of our actors. We needed one more, to be a lead. And as I'm sure you get into that, and things are going, and we're talking, and we were like, looking to film in Atlanta. We had a studio set up. We were talking incentives, and we just could not land the actor that was going to release the financing. And so it pretty much fizzled out, and it lost steam, especially with the pandemic. That hitting everything kind of took a back seat, and the script just sat. And then the opportunity came around, where I was like, what, I want to do something with this. I feel like it's a good story. We put so much time and energy into it. And so I said, yeah, let me see what it would be to adapt it to a novel, and get it out in a different format.
I really appreciate your honesty about being so close to getting this film off the ground. And then what do you do when we know how often those projects fall through? And the fact that you took the script and then made it into a novel, I really think is a testament to younger writers and students of mine that there is so many ways we can get our work out there. So it's great. Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. So let's get into some of the experiences. You write about high school football like someone who's experienced it. Did you play football in high school? And how much of this book is autobiographical?
Yeah, definitely played sports growing up. Football was a big part of my life. I would say I get this question a lot. It's funny. Even my previous work that's dark and dramatic, and it usually deals with trauma and, young adults and going through something. And I get it often, even telling the plot of this story, people will say, what happened to you, in your childhood? What went wrong or whatever? And the reality is nothing. I had a great childhood, and I'm thankful. I'm blessed to have a really good family, and I'm drawn to certain things. What I realized, is I write about my fears, honestly. Loss is a big thing, a big theme in my work. And I have found that, for me to say, well, let me write about my high school experience, probably pretty boring. I don't know if anyone would read that book, but what I use is certain moments, and there are things in the book, where in practice, there's players, as they're running around, they're dogging it, the coaches are yelling, what kind of day is it? And they scream back, it's a great day to be alive. Well, that's real. That was our chant when I was, freshman year getting my butt kicked on the field and thrown up on the sideline. They were making me yell that, right? So there are elements in it that are certainly seeded from past experience. But I think the through line for me, the writing process usually starts with, having that idea and thinking to, like, in this case would be, all right, well, what was, a memory I had from like 10th grade or something that, just still for some reason just comes up from time to time. And then how do I 10X that? And then how do I throw my worst fear in it? And then that's usually where I get some kind of plot simmering to then say, all right, now let's see if this would be interesting. And I go down the path.
So I hear you completely in regards to, pulling personal experiences and then throwing your own fears in it. How much do you, for this book specifically, because I know you have done other work in which you've had to research aspects of the story. Did you have to dig into research outside your own life experience for this?
Not a ton. Some elements, right? So, when they get super nitty gritty with coverages and plays and things, like it's a football book, right? There are some themes that can maybe get a little heady, not in a bad sense, but pretty technical, right? It's part of the character growth where we need to realize kind of what he's up against, and so we get into that. And there's some things we didn't get that intense when I was in high school, right? Some of that's college level stuff, but it served the plot really well, and so there was some, deep diving into that of like, all right, how can I have these plays even, right? It's super geeky aspect, like these plays also that he's trying to run against that we kind of see are also mirroring certain things in the book, right? You could call a coverage an incident with the bully, right? There's kind of a weird mirroring overlap that dives in. So that was some strategic research or planning.
Do you feel like, before we started this interview, we were talking about how even people that don't love sports stories often, or sports, will often gravitate to a good sports story. Football, does it symbolize more than just the game itself in the book?
Yeah, I think so. That was intentional for me too, going into writing it. I want to subvert that genre a little bit, instead of like, the 11th hour victory, maybe I can turn that on its head somehow, right? And take more of what the lesson of the sport is, which is, this is where it is a direct experience, learning that playing a game, I learned more about myself and what life is and how to be a good person and be an individual. All that stuff came from that team environment, right? And that was what made me decide, like, hey, I can take this aspect of like a grandfatherly figure and these fathers and sons and life, and then I can put it in a sports movie bundle, if you will, and allow the metaphors with the game and the real life lessons you learn from the game influence the other, right? And that was kind of the back and forth.
That's a great point. What are the true life lessons? And it makes me think of grief and the lessons we learn from grief. And I'm curious, because grief is so personal and it's a varied experience for everybody that experiences it. When you approach writing about grief authentically, especially from a younger person's point of view, how do you approach it?
Going back to film school, right? When we would map out scenes, we'd say, hey, where are the pitfalls? Where could this go wrong? Grief's a big one for me, right? It's a prominent theme in the book, and I don't want it to feel like grief was just for sake of grief, right? It needed to propel characters, and it needed to be that. So I think for me, it would just, again, putting myself in the shoes, if I could rewind the clock and say, all right, well, what is in my past? What would maybe be something akin to this, almost like an actor? What is the closest headspace I could get into this character's world? And then how do I turn that dial up in whatever degree may need to be necessary to let my imagination go and say, yeah, well, this is how I would react if I face it. And I think that's where, going back to what I said earlier, for me, I try and write about my worst fears. It's not easy, or it's not hard for me to go to that mindset and be like, if that happened, like my world would, like if I were in Morgan's shoes, yeah, that'd be really tough to figure out. But it is that journey and not kind of knowing the way out, and kind of finding the story as I write. That's the enjoyment for me. I've found that even going way back in anything I've written, I always try and step in some other person's shoes. It's an excuse for me to try and live a bunch of different lives as most as I can. So specifically with grief, though, I think it's just trying to stay true to what I think, I would feel in the moment and hope that it rings true for somebody else.
Was there a character in the book that you felt closest to, or one who surprised you as the story developed?
I you had the core cast there of characters, and obviously, it's like picking, they're all your children, right? There's elements in each that I see in myself. And I would say the character of Rabbit, and he became somebody that was like this much in the screenplay. Like his name wasn't even that at that point. It was like this silly little off character. But then, in obviously having to adapt this from screenplay to prose, I had, 130 pages of context to play with at this point to beef it up as a novel, and just being able to explore that character and let him be comic relief but also somebody who's not just a plot device was really fun to explore. And I think that character, through all of them, is probably most like me, and just that he's goofy, he's kind of weird, and yeah, there's moments of levity in other places that you wouldn't necessarily find them. So
What was the most challenging part of writing the story? Were there scenes you found emotionally too difficult to write or, challenging, etc.?
I would say going into and going through it is probably just that second pass of like, I got everything transpired, but then going back and looking for opportunities, it was surprisingly the smaller scenes that I think, carried more weight than I initially thought. And going back, and one of those, to just give an example, there's a scene where Morgan and his dad are literally at a car at the start of their journey. They're sitting in the truck and pumping gas, and it's like a 4-line exchange with a little bit of context, and that's it. But that initial pass, like that was just almost not a throwaway scene. It was important, but I think I missed what it really was. And this whole story, it's a fish out of water story for Morgan, and that was him jumping out of the bowl. And so recognizing that on the second pass, saying like, okay, what they're saying is actually important, and what they're not saying even more important. I got to nail that because it's the bedrock for everything else that comes, right? And so I think there's multiple moments like that, but that one in particular, I wanted to make sure was done well and not missed, because that is really the impetus of everything that comes next.
It makes me think of how you're creating character arcs as well. I'm thinking of teen relationships and how they, both romantic and platonic can be so complicated as teenagers. So how did you approach writing your character's emotional growth? Did you have to go back in time? Like, what was that like for you?
Yeah, it was exactly that, and having to keep the note cards to figure out like, well, where were they going here, and then you find something, you get to the end chapter, you're like, oh man, there's a plant that I actually, or a payoff that happened, but I never planted it, and I got to go back and connect the dots. So, again, most of my writing, I've written every way imaginable, from fully mapped out from A to Z, and then bouncing around, and I found that for me, what tends to work best is just kind of going wherever the muse wants it to go. I'll just, randomly be like, oh, that would be a neat scene. And I'll go ahead and start that scene and write it. And then I'll come back. And so I think for me, the relationships followed that same trajectory. There would be moments, of course, coming from a screenplay, there was already a through line, but then now I've got to, flesh out the story a lot more. And so recognizing opportunity to further relationships, the end of the book is one of those that came out of that process that was never in the script, but I realized there's a really big opportunity to elevate really the core relationship between Morgan and Riley, and just kind of change their whole trajectory with an end moment. That all came out of that. And so, again, just trying to be true to relationships I had in high school and growing up, and then trying to turn those up a degree and say, hey, where could this go as I'm outlining the plot.
When you compare how long it took you to write the screenplay compared to how long it took you to write the novel, is it comparable? Which was faster?
Screenplay was definitely faster. For better or worse, I don't know. It's as they're blueprints. So I've always approached script writing. Yeah, I want the full story there, but I love working with improv actors, and I'm open to what they bring to the table. And so for me, the script was okay at being 80%, because I knew the remainder would get found on set, and inspiration in the moment and all of that, right? Or inspiration on demand when we're there and we've got constraints, we got to figure it out. But the book, I don't have that opportunity or that luxury. And so I went through it with a more fine tooth comb, and just really thinking through every step, and like, is that the correct action for the character here? Or what if I change it here? How does that affect 3 scenes to come? And really just kind of playing editor in a film world in the moment, rather than allowing that just to happen on set or what have you.
So how long did it take you from start to finish, from your first draft to your final manuscript for your novel?
It was about a year. I think it was about a year, maybe a little longer, and obviously revisions within that. But coming from I think when the initial screenplay to manuscript was converted, right? Because I started with all the scenes and I said, I'm just going to turn this into prose format and see where I land. And it was probably about 80 pages. And that was the whole story told. I'm like, okay, well, that's, more of a novella. I want a full novel. And I feel like, all these little scenes that get abbreviated for screen time, maybe it's 2 lines of dialogue, but that's a montage. And so in movie time, that's 10 minutes. Well, not here. That's not even a page. So it was that process of saying, okay, now I need to go back, not only lengthen, but make sure it means something, right? If we're using pages, they have to make sense. It can't just be filler, or it's going to be a really lackluster book with a lot of fluff. So that definitely took some time to do.
So you've touched on during this conversation many different aspects of moving the screenplay into a book. Out of all of the things we've kind of touched on and things we haven't touched on, what do you think the biggest challenge in transforming from one medium to the other was?
The obvious is, of course, like I said, screenwriting is very economical. It's to be a blueprint for the house that you're building, which is the production, right? Versus prose is not. I would say, though, I think it's maybe a catch-22. I think dialogue is super interesting. It reads different than it is said sometimes. So there were some structure things that had to happen, and I like dialogue. I like when characters say things. So my book is probably more dialogue heavy than a traditional narrative would be, but I think that's okay. But I would say in the context of that, there was, just for example, a lot of dual dialogue scenes in the movie where characters are cutting on one another and stepping over. That doesn't necessarily read the best in prose, or can get confusing. And you've got dialogue tags and having to restructure. So it took a little more thought to still get the same emotion that I wanted, but restructuring some things in a different way. And then also being willing to omit lines of dialogue for, internal thoughts, right? Things that you can't really do on screen that much.
That brings up a interesting point. Did you have to lose things that you really didn't want to lose to make the novel work?
Yeah, there were certainly some things. There were certain moments that what I thought were going to carry a lot of weight didn't come through. There's a lot of scenes, again, being what it is, the dynamic of the story. There's a lot of scenes with Wilk, the father, and Morgan, the son. There was a lot of little moments that were supposed to draw out their weight. And I think probably would have played well on screen. And then I get it into book format. I'm like, oh, this is boring. It's just not propelling in the way that it probably would have had I been able to throw a soundtrack under it and this and that. And so there were some things that I was going through and reworking, and I would find even, ironically, maybe a moment that took place in the kitchen, I completely transport it, remove a character, and I could throw that same idea of the scene in a different setting, and something entirely different, even more impactful would happen. And so that, to me, I think was actually the most fun, is saying like, all right, I'm losing something, but how can I use that box to say, can I repurpose this and do something different with it, right? I have all these parts and the fundamentals are there, and I know what I'm trying to say, and I know what the message is, but like, maybe I repurpose it with different characters or what have you, and try something new. And that was enjoyable.
Your prose is often described as lyrical and heartfelt. Was that a conscious stylistic decision, or did it evolve naturally as you wrote?
I run very flowery oftentimes. Like my initial passes, even from way back when, I'm talking even before I went to film school, everything was very almost Shakespearean, like super, whatever, gilding the lily a lot. And so I would often have to pull that back. And I think I've found a balance now that I enjoy reading, which is, some of that economical style of screenplay where it's kind of just blunt. There's some things that are maybe understated, but then there's also maybe in a moment where it is a more profound moment for a character, I can get a little more lyrical or a little more flowery, but it's appropriate for the mood I'm trying to set. And so I think that's been my growth as a writer, is trying to say like, okay, well, maybe in this area where I would have like, a flyover camera, like a Dutch angle here. Well, how can I do that with words and know when, as like a cinematographer would, when less is maybe more, and when to really go full bore with all the movement and that, and then when to just let it be locked off and just a steady shot and let it breathe. And so I found words have allowed me to do that in some respects. And so it's kind of a blend of those two styles that I guess would make it sound lyrical.
I like that. Do you consider While We're Here as a coming of age story, grief novel, a romance? What do you think it is?
I think it's coming of age, and if I were to define it, I think it's coming of age for three different generations, right? I think that title is often thrown toward, young adult, and I think it certainly is that. The main character is, 17, but I think it's also a coming of age for a parent. There's, again, three generations of dealing with the same issue from different perspectives, and I tried to touch on that. And the same thing for the grandfather, right? The whole reason the story came to be was that character, and for him, it was reconciling two generations later with somebody he never really knew, right? His grandson, and having to rebuild that. And so I think for him, there's a coming of age story in that too.
What kind of reader did you imagine while writing this book?
I don't know if I ever built that archetype, maybe myself, when I was first getting into it, writing a story that I would enjoy. And in going through this process and revisiting an earlier draft, I've noticed things that where it was hard for me in some respects to be like, I don't think that way anymore. And I would see things, and so I saw growth within myself just from a different point when I started this to revisiting it. And so I think it was probably written for that, which would be early 20s. And ironically, I think that's probably who the reader would be. I think a lot of the growth and the character choices, and there's college pressure and all these things, along with, things from childhood that you don't want to let go of, right? All of that, I think, points toward that initial life change of being early 20 something, dealing with that.
You're bringing up college pressures, and this question goes right to Morgan Browdy. Do you see him in the future in your mind? Is he playing football at college? Is he getting drafted to pro football? What is the world beyond the world you created for these characters?
Really interesting you bring that up, because I thought about that. I had asked myself when I finished it, what would a sequel look like if I wanted to revisit the world, this world? And I think he probably follows in JD's footsteps, right? He's an old retired scout. I think that's where Morgan maybe goes. He probably had a decent career, but maybe doesn't make it pro. I don't think he was ever that type of character, at least as I envision, but I think he gets close to doing well, and it takes him down a path of one of his mentors, of his grandfather. And so I think if I were to write another, or the story continues, he probably is on the heels of that journey, and maybe coming back home and just revisiting a life that he left behind. I think would be super interesting to see.
What do you want your readers to take away from this book?
Hopefully the understanding that, there's beauty in tragedy. And I think that's something if there's any message in any of my work, anything I've done, even writing it as a reminder to myself, I think trying to find that, right? And that's been my lesson when I write things, right? Writing about things I fear, or concerns I have, or worries, or past, whatever it is, looking for the moments that are present, even in the toughest of times, and still being able to pull that out, right? So you can call it silver linings or what have you, but I think that would be my goal.
From the moment you started writing the script to the moment you finished the book, what are we looking at in years?
About 8 years now.
8 years. So how did it feel to finally hold the book in your hands?
That felt amazing. Yeah. I mean, it's physical hours, right? And yeah, no, it was incredible. And I think it just reinforced that, it's something nice, and especially coming from film where you're not even really shooting on film. It's just kind of out there in this digital world, to actually hold something that you could flip through, and my kids one day could flip through, or whomever, and be like, yeah, this is a tangible thing, that it's time and energy in a product, in a story that you can hold. I think is super cool, and that was certainly rewarding for me. And it's a gift to be able to share your story with anybody. As an artist, I'm sure you understand that too. So I think I just hope the book finds its reader, and if even one person gets something out of it, and I can leave that little impact, that's a win for me.
Thanks so much for speaking with us today. I've loved hearing the conversation.
Likewise. Thank you so much. It's been great, Katie. Thank you.
Look for Trey Manchester's novel, While We're Here, at henrygraypublishing.com, or ask for it at your favorite neighborhood bookstore. Happy reading, everyone.